For the final time in 2021, this is a lunchtime live stream session with Talking Health Tech. How you doing? It's Peter Birch. We're live across every social media platform that will allow us to go live at the same time. Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. Most people joining us on LinkedIn. So drop us a message if you're here live. Perhaps you're joining us for your lunchtime break. I was going to wear a Christmas hat, but that would have been nice and festive, I guess, but I couldn't find one, to be completely honest. But are you gearing up for Christmas? Maybe you're already checked out. Maybe you're just checking out socials and seeing what's happening until you ride out the clock to the end of the day. Who knows? But we're going to have a good chat today because we've got another guest for the live stream session. For those that don't know, Talking Health Tech, it's a podcast. We host a regular show. You can get on any podcast player. But we've been going live each week on social media, doing a bit of a video thing. It's been a great opportunity to connect with people in real time. People also watch it back afterwards as well on any of the social platforms. So do that. And if you're watching back the recording now, drop us a message in the chat too and let us know that you've checked it out as well. And if you have any thoughts on the conversations that we've had throughout the day. Normally, I'm also joined by Aidan Cousins, our community manager. He's just coming back from some leave somewhere. I'm gonna have to find out where he was. No, he'll be back in the community. For those that are part of THT Plus, they would have noticed a little bit quiet in the community the past couple of days. Aidan's been having a bit of a break and he'll be back on as of tomorrow, I believe. So that's super exciting. But in the meantime, today on the show, I am joined by Marcus Wilson from Surgical Partners. Marcus, how you doing?
G'day, Pete. How are you?
I'm awesome, mate. It's great to have you on the live stream. It's just a reminder to everyone, you can drop a comment, drop a message, let us know that you're watching and shape how the conversation goes. But it's always great catching up with you, Marcus, because we don't really have to plan too much prior to well, maybe we should actually. Maybe we should. Maybe that's not a good thing. But there's always something to talk about when you and I jump on the microphone, I guess.
Oh, it's always good to do one long take in my mind, and that's what a live stream is. And good freewheeling conversation. There's always lots to talk about. So
yeah,
keen to get into it.
Yeah, let's do it. But then for those that don't know, Marcus is involved in a lot of aspects of healthcare, but particularly payments and everything you do at Surgical Partners. What's I've seen a lot happening with, we can get stuck into it really, because I've not really dug into it, and I feel like I should have. But a lot of people are talking about payroll tax, and I don't really know why. Are you able to tell me a bit more about it?
Yeah, what a topic for silly season, huh? Like I've dressed up in my shirt and everything, the holiday vibe, and
payroll
here we go, payroll tax. Make a lot of people yawn, but it's the burning issue of the industry at the moment. Right. And by industry, I'm talking about healthcare services, so community healthcare services. GP specialists, dentists, some allied health are caught up in this. Okay. Well, there's lots of industries that are actually caught up in it, but when we talk health, it's specifically the kind of business models where the practices effectively collect on behalf of the doctors who work there. Mm-hmm. And those doctors or dentists are independent medical practitioners who work in that clinic. And the practice is collecting on their behalf and then usually taking a percentage service fee and distributing the difference. Now, we've had some recent case law come to light. There's been a number of case law that's come to light over the last few years, but there was a really interesting one that landed in September, the Thomas and Nas case. And what this basically said, amongst other things, there's lots of kind of obvious things that have been floating around for a while that surface, like you can't, have your doctors on rosters, or you can't, have leave for independent medical practitioners, because if you're doing rosters and leave and you're saying stuff to the doctors like you can't own the medical records, they're owned by us, the practice. If you're saying things like that, particularly in the contracts with the doctors, if you're spelling it out that obviously, then that's going to come under the purview of the state governments who go, hang on, how independent are these medical practitioners? You're controlling them and all that stuff. So are they effectively sham contractors? Therefore, should they be subject to payroll tax? So that distributed amount, that net amount that the doctors are getting, does that constitute a payment? And it all comes down to these definitions of relevant contracts. What makes a contract relevant? Anyway, the net impact of that detail is that there are heaps of practices around the country based off this New South Wales case law that are getting pursued for not only payroll tax going forward, but back payroll taxes.
And so this is something that people are just concerned about, or they're actually getting approached and saying, "Hey, it's like..."
Oh, they're getting up.
Yeah,
all over the place, including some famous names that, we've got a really sort of inside look into who these practices are. I mean, they're clients of ours. We know them. Not appropriate for me to talk about them, but there's some big names caught up in this. And I can tell you it's not just the independents who are concerned about this, the corporates in particular. A lot of corporates are now owned by private equity. Some corporates are looking to IPO. It's very difficult to go into these kind of major corporate transactions when you've got a contingent liability of potentially 20, 30, 40 million bucks in back payroll taxes sitting on your financials. So it's a big issue for the corporates. It's a big issue for independents. And for the independents, it's, often, doctor-owned medical practices who are staring down the barrel of, $1 million in back payroll taxes. And they're just like, where am I going to find that?
Yeah.
And this is a big issue. So, we've seen some clients, doing the phoenixing type stuff where they know this is coming. So they kind of wind up their practice and start up a new entity under a new structure to not only sort of protect themselves going forward, but just wind up the company so that, OSR can't come after them. And a lot of this going on. So it affects the entire industry. I mean, when I say entire, I mean like 80 to 90%, essentially everybody. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's always been, that whole arrangement of a clinician, whether it's a GP or also in the allied space and dental, it's that whole, they're not an employee, but at the same time, there needs to be a lot of control around it. It very much skirts that line of not being, and it's all, and there's all that kind of the tax game, but it impacts both sides, really, doesn't it? So
it does.
Yeah.
And it's there's two kind of elements to it, really, to address it. One is, well, you've got to make your contract ship shape. I'm not an accountant or a lawyer, so if anyone out there is listening and taking this seriously, please get professional advice. But clearly there's an issue around the contract, and you can't have stuff like restraints of trade on the doctors. You can't go down the road and work. You can't do that. You can't have, we own the patients, you don't own them. Well, then they're not independent. There are basic things in the contract which, shouldn't have any of that. And I guess the funny thing about this part of the problem is that a lot of people think that the corporates are more controlling. They think the corporates are the ones who sue their doctors. And look, there has been that in the past, and that they're more controlling around doctors, what they can do. But in my experience, by and large, the corporates are actually very wise to this risk, right? And so their contracts in this light are actually more compliant, certainly on average, than the independents. I mean, there's plenty of independent practices out there that don't have contracts at all. They're just like a handshake agreement, right? And so there's this whole thing about the design of the contracts, which is a bit legalistic and boring, but highly relevant. There's that. But what really came to bear, which is really interesting, in the last case, the Thomas and Nas case, was this this concept of a flow of money being a problem. So typically what we've seen in the industry is we've seen the practices, instead of having like one bank account, have set up a separate account, a collections account, where they receive all of the money for all of the doctors, regardless of whether they're employees or contractors or whatever, but they receive all of the money, and then they transfer the service fees into their operating account. They're like, pay their staff, pay their rent and everything. So they've got a separate account. Now, the problem is that's a separation of monies, which is kind of in the right direction, but it's owned by the practice. That collections account is owned by the practice. So what the officers of state revenue say is kind of, well, if there was a third-party liability case, or if there was a liquidation, then against the practice, then they're going to come after that money because it's owned in the ABN of the practice, right? And so a collections account of convenience is actually the words they used in the case. A collections account of convenience is not good enough. So what they're essentially saying is the money needs to flow through an account or go directly to the individual doctors or dentists or whatever. It can't pass through the practice because, you know, if the practice never receives it and never distributes it, then how could it be affected by payroll tax? Now, it still could be if there's all this junk in the contracts, the other part of it. If the contracts are deemed relevant because they've got all these, you know, sham elements, well, they could well still get caught up into. But I think what really set the industry alight with panic was this flow of money decision or issue and how that was approached. So, you know, that is what has really got everyone jumping and looking at different models of how they distribute to their doctors and how that money flows. So now I can talk to that because what we're seeing is, you know, I hope this is interesting to everyone, by the way. I mean,
by the way, for those that are just checking out and stumble across it on socials, you can drop a message or something in the chat so we can see that here. If you're watching live, if you're watching the recording, make sure you leave some comments on the topic as well. But no, continue. I'm interested in the impact of it.
Absolutely. Let's make it interactive, guys. So, I mean, I'm talking about payroll tax. It's not the most silly season of topics, as I said before. So, you know, make it interactive. Make sure that, you know, the experience we have can be tailored to something that's interesting to you. But look, there's three key things that we're seeing evolve in the market. One is setting up separate bank accounts for doctors. Now, this is the easy thing from a legal perspective. It's like, okay, let's just kill this problem. Let's just set up individual bank accounts for doctors or get them to set up accounts or use their existing accounts and just put the money in there. Now, just put the money in there. Now, that's something that's very easy from a legal perspective, easy from a lawyer perspective. But from a practice manager perspective, that is a nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare. It is hard enough to ensure you're collecting and reconciling payments for an entire practice into one account. To try and divvy that up accurately between individual doctors' accounts is a nightmare, absolute nightmare. And bank reconciliation, forget it. I mean,
so you're saying you would take so you had a clinic with 5 doctors working within it, and so you had 100 patients come in, and then so 20 of those the money that comes from the practice or Medicare. I guess. So either then when it gets paid, independent on which provider it was, it would then need to go into that respective account. It can't sit in one account and then be distributed out afterwards.
It would go into their bank account, and then the doctors would effectively pay a service fee from their account back to the practice. So the practice doesn't get it first.
Yeah, right.
Now, that's interesting in that certain payment types are suited towards that. Medicare and DVA payments are suited toward that individual account model. Indeed, there are practices out there already who, for Medicare and DVA, it went to the doctor's account, and for everything else, it's collected by the practice, and then just that bit is distributed, you know, net of what they owe back from the Medicare and DVA. Anyway, look, there's some practices are doing that anyway because the Medicare and DVA is relatively easy to segregate. It's relatively reliable. But then you get into stuff like work cover, lawyers, cash. This stuff, segregating it into individual accounts is ridiculously impossible. It's and you know, for all the effort that would go into making sure it is in the right account, charging it back if it went into the wrong one, putting it into the right account, by the time you're juggling all of that and explaining all of that to the doctors and making sure it's right, and you'll never get it right, you might as well pay the payroll tax. Like, is that much of a nightmare to do? And particularly across, you know, hundreds, thousands of doctors, not going to happen. And I go back to what I was saying before around bank rec. I just saw a comment. I believe that was from who was that? Daniel Green Square.
It looks like Daniel Green Square.
Yeah, we've had a number of discussions on this kind of topic. I mean, we all know how hard it is just to reconcile one account. Reconciling multiple accounts under this kind of scenario. Anyway, look, it's one of those really easy options. And if you're really scared about getting the OSR knocking on your door and about to sting you for $1 million and you don't have the legal wherewithal to fight it, then this as an easy option kind of, you know, you're tempted by it because, you know, It's a real risk. And so we are seeing a lot of clients out there do that. So that's one option. One option, separate bank accounts. There's a few different flavors of how that can be arranged, but holy hell, not for me. Thank you very much. And then the middle one is one that's kind of been around for a while. It's this kind of concept of a trust. So it's where you have a separate trust entity owned by the doctors, where the doctors are the beneficiary, and it owns an account. The director of the trustee company could be the operator. It could be the medical practice owner. Could be. But you would have certain provisions in there, again, get legal advice, but the certain provisions in there where the doctors can vote out the operator if there's a majority, if they want to. So the doctors have control over this trust. They're the beneficiaries. All the money goes into that one account and then gets distributed out to them. So they own the account, not the practice. So that's one way of getting around the flow of money problem. There is some suspicion out there amongst accountants who I speak to that this could fall under anti-avoidance provisions potentially. So as always, get good advice. But that has been around for a little while. It's not necessarily novel, but I think that there are a couple of advisory firms that we've worked with who have come up with some really neat models around this where, the participation in the trust, being a beneficiary of the trust, is kind of inherent in the service fee agreement with the practice. So while you're under the service fee agreement, you're a beneficiary of the trust, and as soon as you're not, you're out. And, so there can be some relatively frictionless, as far as they can be, of managing that kind of trust structure, because frankly, it is a bit painful. You have to set up the trust, you have to explain it to the doctors. It's hard to explain things to doctors in some ways.
Yeah.
In many ways, doctors are very clever, but in some ways it's kind of hard to discuss some of these complexities with them, right? And so there's that. And then there's a third option, which doesn't exist yet, but we are putting a lot of faith in. And again, get your own advice, but I think I know there is a real opportunity here for an institutionally backed account, which is held for benefit of doctors. And this institutional account could be something that is supplied by a bank, like a banking as a service. And this already exists if you think about it. This is where it ties into payments, Peter, where if you think about HiCaps or Tyro, they take money from upstream, right? They take money from Visa, MasterCard, Amex. They take money from health funds. They take money from work cover. In some cases, they're connecting upstream to some work cover schemes. They take that money and they pool it, and then they settle it T+1 or T+2. So this is already happening. They're already holding money in these reconciliation accounts for benefit of the practice or for benefit of the doctors. So these things already exist. It's not a new structure. What we're effectively talking to here is extending that for like a week or two, collecting all of that money for benefit of the doctors, distributing their share to them, and then distributing the service fee to the practice. So watch this space. There's some really powerful, it's a really powerful technical solution that's based on, as I said, things that already exist. It is a new financial product. So it is not something that can just be available to the market on a dime. But I really think this is the most elegant solution to this problem. And, I unfortunately can't talk about all aspects of it now, but that's the concept. And I think that is most likely the best solution to this problem. It doesn't have that separate bank account issue, doesn't have the trust thing you have to set up and explain to the doctors, even though that can be done relatively neatly. Yeah. So, yeah.
Geez, it's a tough, before, I saw a couple of comments in the chat there, but geez, it's a tough slog as a practice owner, isn't it? When you've got all the other kind of things going on, the amount of detail and the amount of rigmarole required to get paid and make sure you're not going to get slugged with excessive tax unnecessarily. It's there's a lot of complexity. So you need to have a good team in your camp, that's for sure, to be able to go through
well advised. And I think the reality is, I noticed David's commenting on here, Steve Whittington, these guys very experienced in providing services to the industry. And the thing is, you really do need to be well advised. This is where advice is worth its weight. Advice doesn't come cheaply, but this is not the time for handshakes. If the OSR comes after you and there's just, let alone bad documentation, there's none. Well, that's just so dangerous. So dangerous.
Yeah. Cool. So just a reminder for those that might be checking it out, we're chatting live across social media. and drop a message in the chat. We can see a few here engaging. We're getting in the festive spirit by talking about payroll tax, people, because that's the kind of people that we are. But no, and the interesting impacts that it has on the outpatient healthcare space. David, thanks for your input too. A lot of people are across this, and it's bringing up different ways to address the problem.
Maybe just to tie that into payments. Obviously, the more that the payment spectrum, we've talked about this before, Peter, in I think in one of our
the summit sessions,
podcasts. Yeah. So the more broad spectrum that payments are, and it's interesting to see Daniel on this. We've talked about a couple of the different payment types that are coming into the market. We've seen people like HotDoc, we've seen people like Health Engine, we've seen more and more people taking payments. And what we've seen with some of our clients is they're actually taking more in payments for telehealth than they are through their merchant terminal in the practice. So online is overtaking in clinic, and that is obviously driven by telehealth. It's driven by things like repeat scripts, and so you've got more and more payment spectrum coming in. And if that's being driven by multiple providers like Stripe, like PIN payments, Tyro e-commerce is doing a bit of this. If you have all these different payments trying to settle this, then it just gets harder and harder to reconcile. And if you're doing it in those separate bank accounts, again, adding complexity to something as complex as separate bank accounts, one per doctor, unbelievably painful. But even when it's done in the practice, the more payment types you're receiving, just the harder it is to control. And so what we've talked about in our previous podcast is the importance of broad spectrum claiming potential. And the two leaders in this space, as we've talked about before, are really Tyro Medipass. And the emergent one, watch this space, is CBA coming to market with their, I think it's called CommBank Health Claim was the original name, might be CommBank Smart Health now, but they're bringing to market something pretty exciting from a broad spectrum perspective. So, by broad spectrum, I mean it does Medicare Easy Claim, does obviously FPOS and credit cards, does upstream connections to health funds, does upstream connections to work cover, such that this broader stream of spectrum, the broader spectrum of claims that dental primary health does, is captured in one single settlement. And that is all across all the doctors, ideally in one of these compliance structures we talked about. But it also integrates into the PMS. Part of the problem we're seeing with these, like Stripe and all these other payment types for telehealth is, one, they're an extra settlement, which is painful. Two, they don't integrate to the PMS. And if that circle isn't closed, if there's not that digital control plus an extra type to think of, it just makes it so much harder. And so I think what's going to dovetail really neatly into an elegant payroll tax solution is going to be the adoption of these broad spectrum payment types. The other thing that I think is going to dovetail into this various solutions to the payroll tax problem is more elegant, frictionless contracting between the doctors and the practices, or dentists and practices. So making it really easy to onboard, offboard, change contract types or contract terms. So let's just say vaccination, COVAX comes in and go, right, well, we want to pay a different percentage to doctors to encourage them to do more COVAX. Do you have to go back and revisit very expensive contracts in order to do that, service fee agreements? Or what if you just had, an extra term comes up in the contract online, and on an app, the doctor just DocuSigns, yes, I agree to that, updates the contract as an addendum, and then prints that in the software, which, automates that payment. So I think more frictionless platforms that, take the sort of pain out of, making these different, arrangements between practices and doctors, ideally and then you start involving third parties, like potentially an institution who's holding this money for benefit of the doctors. There's going to have to be agreements there too. So invariably, the solution is going to be more complex than historically. And if you can take the complexity out of that by using cool digital tools that take that friction out, then I think there's a big opportunity set in that part of the market as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for the engagement in the chat. Everyone giving their perspectives and raising some valid challenges. Stephen, obviously quite across the allied space in particular, and the challenges that might be come across there when it comes to trusts. And Daniel, some real world experience of running a practice, and the challenges that need to be overcome there too. Hey, look, we just thinking further. We were chatting before we went live, Marcus. One thing that's created, like moving on from the discussions around payroll tax and payments for a second, but or maybe building on that and looking at the 10-year plan for general practice, I believe. So you've seen that in a bit of detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a number of drafts that have been out there for consultation. This is something that's been long in the oven. I believe it's been chaired by Steve Hamilton, who's been involved in many of these reviews over the years. It's out there for consultation now, and obviously there's a lot of engagement, as there always is with these issues around continuity of care. And how to encourage patients to come back and see their GP. Some of the more continuity of care with the same general practitioner and the same practice. These are all important issues. Obviously, probably the more sensitive part of that's seen a lot of commentary is that there won't be MBS funded telehealth unless it's provided by the registered practice. And so all of this anchors around this concept of voluntary patient registration. VPR, the government's throwing something like $65 million to set this all up under the Medicare framework. And one of the sticks they're using is, from some period, maybe mid next year, I don't think affirmed it too much, but from some period next year, you will not be able to get your telehealth funded unless that patient is registered to the practice. Now, none of this has been agreed or finalised yet. It's all consultation, and so another part of this, even though there's less detail around this, but basically what the government has said across this 10-year plan, our goal is to move 40% of fee for service under more capitated or value-based funding. Now, capitation is a bit of a dirty word, and everyone thinks of negative experiences, NHS and all this stuff. So there's a normal kind of pushback you would expect from policies like this. And I think that the good news when you're kind of considering something like this is that we've been here before. Old hats in the industry, like David, been around a long time, probably seen various incarnations of this, but the most recent one was the healthcare homes trial. So a few people listening in here might have been involved in those trials. I'm sure you saw heaps of material about this. The PHNs, certain PHNs that were involved in the trial were heavily involved. And essentially what this was about was something similar. It was about capitating funding for certain patient cohorts, and particularly around chronic disease management. And what happened then is it failed spectacularly. Let's call it what happened. I mean, the healthcare homes trial was an unmitigated disaster. I mean, hopefully they learnt things from that they're then putting into this new 10-year plan. But I would like to put that one of the key reasons it's failed, and this was talked about in some of the postmortems that were written, especially you got to write postmortems when this much government money has just been torched. You have to. Yes. So there's some postmortems, and one of them talked about the funding issue. And this was a real issue where, basically for certain cohorts of patients, the money was capitated. And so what the practices would have to do is they'd have to work out, well, what if the home doctor wasn't at the practice today that this registered patient came in and they saw another doctor? And so one of the solutions, for example, was they created dummy item codes for zero value where, because there was no payment, it was a bundled payment, but this patient came in and saw this doctor. So how are we going to get that doctor remunerated for the fact that they saw someone who wasn't their patient? You can just see how this is unwinding into a nightmare, as you can imagine. Anyway, so there were a few models around it, and that dummy item code could then create a distribution to that doctor through a sort of a dummy model on the side. But you can see how this, as a remuneration tool, to have to explain that, to get the doctors in the practice on board, to get the doctors in the industry on board, yeah, it went down like a lead balloon, right? And so, I mean, we had enough trouble as a technology provider to the industry coming up with a solution for that. And we did eventually, but to change everything that we could to do that and then have to explain that to our customers was a bit of a nightmare. And I think that this kind of problem set, be interested in anyone else's views on the chat here, but I think this kind of problem set is what is going to make this 10-year plan fly or fail. And my suspicion is, based on recent experience, I can't see any of that movement from fee to service to capitated. You know, I mean, there's some pretty powerful sort of carrot and sticks around telehealth, I guess, but you know, for in-clinic stuff, I can't see it moving anywhere like the pace that the government expects. And as I said, witness healthcare homes. I think you're going to struggle.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's certainly calls for it, and there's calls for a move to a more value-based model. I can see from other perspectives how, you know, from a public health perspective and a person-centered side of things, that needs to change. But then in terms of the actual doctors getting paid for it and the adoption from the industry, that's going to be a real challenge.
It is.
I think you know, particularly when you've got, and this came up before, I think, with healthcare homes and the complexities around, well, if you're a clinician on the eastern, you know, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney versus a clinician in Darwin or, you know, rural and remote areas of the country, places were higher, or even just in Western Sydney, and, you know, higher instances of chronic disease and whatnot. How does that impact remuneration? And, you know, what we're tying to, well, that's more around outcomes, but, you know, there's just, it really, it's kind of in this funny spot where people calling for it to change, but at the same time, there's no real clear path ahead. So it's going to be interesting seeing that, people's perspectives.
Yeah, and you know, good to see a couple coming through here now. You know, it's interesting. You reflect back on telehealth and the explosion in telehealth services, and we always got to remind ourselves that it was telephone health services, not video health services, that exploded in the last year and a half. And you know, I keep reminding people in the industry that the explosion of telehealth wasn't because of COVID directly. The explosion of telehealth was because the government funded it.
Yeah.
At the end of the day,
yeah,
it's not the clinical demand specifically that moves it. It's what gets paid for. I mean, and that's why I think our perspective on the market around what is getting paid for, what is moving the market, you know, where is a out of pocket more relevant to something else, how to change incentives for doctors to do things that are, yes, in the patient's interest, of course, but to do things compliantly. How can you incentivize that through, you know, the physical management of money to them? Is what matters. That's what matters. You know, we're in a very competitive environment right now for doctors. Very competitive. And so, you know, getting these kind of incentive structures right, and those that really, you know, understand the data in their practice, you know, products like Cubico, fantastic. You know, you can really, you know, find unbilled stuff. You can, you know, if you change any of the kind of settings between in the contract between the doctor and the practice, you can actually see, well, how does that play out? And, you know, do we get more engagement around this particular clinical area using that data? And so you can really use those realities of incentives that, you know, healthcare is no different to any other industry. Incentives drive behavior, and to actually monitor that and see whether those incentives are successful and tinker with that a bit is absolutely possible now with the access to data that we have. And so, fee for service models going to capitated.
Well, it comes down to what Daniel has pointed out there in the chat too. If it depends on what the goal is, and if it's about limiting spending on health. The
Yep.
push for capitation and registration will march on and let the bodies lay where they are in terms of small clinic operators. So that's certainly a factor.
Yeah, I like Daniel's comment here. If it's truly about patient outcomes, then it needs needs-based funding to clinics on top of the fee-for-service. Yeah, but clearly, I mean, I don't think anyone's blinded by this policy. It is clearly about reducing spend. Or getting better outcomes for spend. And clearly, as Daniel's saying, that's the independents, are going to be more exposed under this model. I absolutely agree. And it doesn't, and again, you can always look to history here. I really like Daniel's comment here. I mean, if you look to history in the healthcare homes trial, the representation of corporates in those trials, I think, was something like 65% of the trial practices were corporates, corporate owned. And I think if you look at the whole industry, it's more like, 25, maybe going on 30%. So it was more than double the representation, clearly capitated money going to the practice as opposed to fee for service to an individual doctor. You just think at a high level, clearly that's more interesting to consolidated corporate providers. And the government's smart, I think, and I don't think the government is often given less credit than it deserves for how much they know and how clever they are at managing the microeconomics of health. And, as much as they never say so, it's clearly in their interest to corporatize the market. I mean, the economics of GPs say is different to pathology, but the government incentives to consolidate pathology, I mean, they were real and they saved the government a hell of a lot of money. And, yes, the economics of GPs are different, but it's similar kind of policy. So those who are familiar with pathology know that there's the coning system. So if a patient gets 14 tests, like a panel of 14 tests, the pathology company only gets paid for the first 3. So clearly, by Medicare anyway, I mean, if they can charge privately, they can do whatever they want. But, it's capitated, right? And so that clearly drives scale in a very scalable segment of the industry like pathology, clearly drives scale.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we're talking about here. It's a capitated type of funding, and the government's going to be looking for similar outcomes from that, no doubt.
Always love a chat, Marcus. Thank you for coming on and sharing. There's so much that I have not dug into. You seem to know the hot topics right now for those operating practices, both from a corporate and an individual, independent clinics perspective. We've seen in the chat those that are, active in the industry and those running clinics themselves. They're real issues that everyone's facing. So hopefully, we can have some clarity moving into a new year for people to ultimately run successful businesses and look after patients. That's what it comes down to. But
interesting comment from Steve here too, Pete. Just tethering patients to a brick and mortar location seems to be more about blocking revenue from telehealth startups. Interesting perspective. And patient outcomes. I mean, we've seen so many telehealth startups. I mean, have you seen those mud maps that Mr. Perfect does? What's his name? Terry.
Terry from Doctology.
Yep. Yeah, the Doctology, right? I mean, the mud maps for telehealth just in Australia, it's like,
a lot of providers.
Like if the barrier to entry is that low, I mean, there are going to be so many losers in this space, particularly when we really respect, Steve's comment there, which is about, it's clearly about limiting their opportunity set. It's really interesting. Just maybe to finish on this, look, I'm a very healthy 45-year-old, but I seem to be getting bombarded with these ads on social media for erectile dysfunction. Have you seen this? Like there's Mosh, there's Pilot, there's Rosemary Health, there's Instant Consult. I mean, I hope it's not just me. I mean,
I like to hope that it's because of the role of talking health tech that I get approached for these things, but maybe it's because of my demographic. I'm not too far behind you, Marcus, in terms of...
maybe it's what we're searching. I don't know. Yeah. But anyway...
the correlation. But
anyway, bombarded with this stuff. And, if telehealth and, online prescriptions and all of that, if that's really digital health, flogging, erectile dysfunction, I mean, Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate, I think. Hopefully there's deeper value that they can add to this.
I've seen, there's like, the Midnight Health guys, they've been
Midnight Health.
pretty active recently, just with, acquired 50% from NIB. But, in speaking with Nick in particular from Midnight recently, he's also going to be speaking at the summit there.
Yep.
In particular, his ethos is very much around making sure like that they're still tied in with the ecosystem and not ignoring the broader health of an individual. So there's some organizations who are cognizant of their, like, the broader ecosystem, the importance of bringing a patient back to their family GP and those aspects. But also there is a need for, increased accessibility in different areas for these types of services. So hopefully those that have the right understanding of the industry and doing things for the right reasons can solve these. Because in the end, if the problem to be solved is, for us, it's like increasing accessibility in rural and remote locations, I feel like is a kind of prime thing that would need to be solved in Australia. But it's not really, but I don't think a big problem to be solved is serving up more ads for erectile dysfunction to dudes in Sydney, like it might be handy, but, big problems to be solved in healthcare right now. We can't bring talented clinicians to parts of Australia that need healthcare the most. So how can technology be used to solve those problems? And if it's the adjunct to, the physical in-person consult is an element on an app or with remote monitoring and other bits and pieces, I feel like that's the role of telehealth and virtual care and all those bits and pieces. But sure, like, there's going to be businesses that'll look to scale up and provide solutions, and it's a bit of a short-term vision, but there's also those others that are out there looking to do something a bit more meaningful. So
I think data play a bit of a role in that too. I mean, I talked before about Cubico, and on one of, I think it was the Winter Summit that we had with Chris and I on, just talking about, how can that sort of risk and return for a practitioner who might be doing a bit of rosemary or mosh or pilot on the side in the evenings, how can they kind of trade that off with, what they're doing in clinic? And as you say, how can that be better integrated? How can that be, less about just, flogging pills and more about, continuity of care. And I absolutely agree. It'd be certainly wise for those guys to, it's interesting comment here from the head of pilot, Eucalyptus Health, contacted me. I put him onto Todd Cameron in the early days when they were really fleshing out their business model, because, Todd is just so outspoken, and I thought he'd be a great guy to connect to, and for those Eucalyptus guys, the pilot guys, to really understand like what are the realities, the mechanics of the way GPs think around engaging with these tools versus in clinic, and hopefully they found that instructive. But I mean, it's big business now. My understanding is Eucalyptus has something like 50 to 60 GPs running this now. Some of the smaller players might have 10 or 20, but Eucalyptus is really leading the charge here, and they raised something like what, $30 million or something in their last race. I mean, it's big money.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, look, I reckon we're going to call this live stream a wrap, Marcus. We've been very lucky to be joined by a number of intelligent people providing insights during their lunch. So thank you for that. The recording's available for those. I do know many people do check it out after hours as well. So drop us a message if you've got some perspectives and tell us what you want to hear about next time too. We're planning for next year and looking forward to having are you getting away for Christmas, Marcus? You doing anything exciting?
Yeah, my family's kind of forcing me to have a few weeks break. I really need it, to be honest. This has been a really challenging
year. So grudgingly, you're like, no, I'll take a break, I guess.
It's been a huge year of growth and lots of exciting things to come next year. And I really hope we can, work with our partners to really, get a great outcome for this payroll tax thing. So that's one of the things that's preventing me taking much of a break. But I'll get some time, which would be great. Bit of silly season.
Love it. Well, look, you know what? I'm going to close this session with our. Have you seen the 12 Days of Health Tech Christmas that we've created, Marcus? We've got a video. It's a song that I'm sure is going to hit the Christmas charts that happen every year in the UK. I'm fairly sure this will be up there as number one, although I'm sure there's some copyright issues there too. So I'm going to play that to lead out the end of this live stream. So thank you, Daniel, Stephen, and we had Dave and had others in the chat there too. I'm sure we'll connect before the end of the year. And Marcus, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me live.
Cheers, guys. Cheers, everyone. Happy Christmas.
Catch you later.
See ya.
On the first day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me interoperability. On the second day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 2 health records and interoperability. On the third day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the fourth day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the fifth day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the sixth day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the seventh day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the 8th day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 8 online bookings, 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the 9th day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 9 virtual consults, 8 online bookings, 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the 10th day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 10 e-prescriptions, 9 virtual consults, 8 online bookings, 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the 11th day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 11 VR headsets, 10 e-prescriptions, 9 virtual consults, 8 online bookings, 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability. On the 12th day of Christmas, Talking Health Tech gave to me 12 patient portals, 11 VR headsets, 10 e-prescriptions, 9 virtual consults, 8 online bookings, 7 algorithms, 6 health exchanges, remote monitoring, 4 data lakes, 3 MRAMs, 2 health records and interoperability.